Hello, this is the second podcast that looks at the birth of the Weimar Republic. This second podcast just picks up and carries on the theme of the German Revolution. What we saw in the first podcast, we looked at the map and we identified that Germany seemed to be winning the war. The war had been fought on two fronts, firstly against Russia and secondly against France and Britain. Germany had won the war in the east against Russia and had taken lots of territory from Russia, and in the west, Germany felt she could still win the war against France, but in actual fact America had come into the war on the side of France and Britain, and Germany was in rapid retreat. That was the military situation, but many soldiers out there on the front believed that Germany could still win the war. And no German soldier had retreated onto Germany's own soil. That's an important factor. There was no damage, no physical damage done to Germany by fighting. No foreign soldiers set foot on German soil. There was no bombing of Germany at all. However, we finished off the first podcast by saying that beneath all of that, the strain on Germany was huge. The ordinary civilians had been fighting 4 long years, and literally the factories and the farms were buckling by November 1918. And the story began, as we saw in the last podcast, in the port of Kiel, which is there in the north, and it rapidly spilt over to the capital city, Berlin, there. So continuing the story, basically what happened is sailors at Kiel refused to set out to fight the British Navy in late in October. So the end of October, basically they mutinied. The word for when sailors, or when any soldier or sailor refuses to obey their officer, we call it a mutiny. Okay, so there was a mutiny on the boats, the battleships that were docked at the port of Kiel. Okay. They effectively, the sailors marched to the capital city, Berlin, and they demanded the Kaiser's abdication. Now, the Kaiser was the emperor of Germany. Okay, that's an important thing. Germany was an emperor ruled by a monarch. Okay, so the emperor is the head of state, the figurehead, and the point is, like any other monarch, and a king or a queen is a monarch as well, they have their power by birth. Now, the setup in Germany basically meant that the Kaiser had an enormous amount of power, and the sailors were blaming him for the misery that they were living in. Now, the sailors had huge support. Shortages of raw material and food. There was a massive flu. It says epidemic. It was actually a pandemic that was wiping out. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of Germans were dying of Spanish flu by November 1918. So beneath the story of what looked like military success, the country was literally buckling. The Kaiser was aware of that, and the Kaiser basically stepped down from power on the 9th of November. And he left the country and he went to Holland. End of story. That's the end of the Kaiser. Germany no longer has a Kaiser, an emperor. The monarch has stepped down from power. So what then happens? Beneath the Kaiser was an elected parliament. Now, the elected parliament, called the Reichstag, and we'll do more about this in the next podcast, but the elected parliament of Germany had always been relatively powerless in the days of the Kaiser. The Kaiser had just really only consulted parliament. Now, like any other parliament, it's 400 or 500 elected men. They consisted of different political parties. Now, the largest political party were called the Social Democrats, and the leader of the Social Democrats was a man called Friedrich Ebert. And basically, Ebert, as the leader of the largest party, the party that represented the majority of Germans, it was the largest party in the parliament, Ebert basically stepped in to fill the gap that had been caused by the Kaiser's abdication. And basically he declared that Germany was now a republic. In other words, the monarch was gone. Now he was very reasonable. He said, the war is still going on. The first thing we've got to do is end the war. 2 days later, he surrendered, and so that all soldiers could return to Germany. And he said, as soon as we possibly can, we need to draw up a constitution. We need to decide how the country is going to be run. And his very first decision was it needed to be a much fairer system, a more democratic system in which the elected parliament had power rather than the head of state, rather than the person at the top. So that decision was made. Ebert said, for the moment, I will be the head of state, and because he's not a monarch, he called himself a president. So President Ebert retreated to the town of Weimar to work on the task of drawing up a constitution. The reason he did that was Berlin was too dangerous to be used as a capital city, because there was an uprising. There was an extremist group called the Spartacists, more on that in a second, who were attempting to seize power. The map there kind of shows you where Weimar is, the capital city Berlin, which you can see there was too dangerous a place for government to be based for the time being. So you've got to try to imagine that what you've actually got now is you've got soldiers, German soldiers are now returning home from the fighting. The war has actually ended, so German soldiers are returning home. Now, who were the Spartacists? The Spartacists were what we more commonly call believers in communism. They were led by Rosa Luxemburg, you can see her there, and Karl Liebknecht. Now, a year earlier in Russia, the working classes, had overthrown the Russian emperor and had seized power. And they had set up a system of government in which power was completely taken over by the poor, by the workers in the cities, by the farm labourers in the countryside. People with property, with education, etc., what we call the middle classes and the upper classes as well, were literally completely overthrown. They lost everything inside Russia. Now, this isn't what Ebert in Germany wanted. Ebert wanted a democratic society in which rich and poor could exist peacefully side by side, and in which the poor would have more influence, but he didn't want to completely overthrow the rich. But the Spartacists were different. They effectively wanted to completely abolish the middle classes, the well-off, and give complete power to the workers. Now, basically what happened is attempting to copy what the workers in Russia had done a year earlier, the Spartacists tried to take power in the capital city of Berlin in January 1919. And Ebert, the temporary president, basically in a panic, thought, well, how do I stop this actually? How do I prevent them succeeding? He was obviously afraid of a communist revolution, and he wasn't alone. You imagine the German middle classes, anybody with property and wealth and influence, people who had worked their way up to have a degree of influence and status, they were also in panic at what was actually happening, because they didn't want Germany to turn out the way Russia had turned out a year earlier in 1917. So Ebert, basically looking around, called on the returning soldiers, the soldiers who were coming back from the fighting in France and Belgium. He called on them to stop the uprising. Now, strictly speaking, they were supposed, the returning soldiers, because Germany had surrendered, should have basically given their guns over to the Allies, but Ebert said, no, I want these people to keep hold of their guns, but instead of shooting them at the French and the British and the Americans, I now want them to go to Berlin and shoot at the Spartacists, which is basically what happened. And we call these soldiers the Freikorps. Now, we'll do more on who the Freikorps were, but as I say, they're ex-soldiers from the front. And for the moment, they are working with Ebert. That doesn't mean they liked Ebert, because basically they resented the fact, remember, that Ebert had surrendered. These ex-soldiers believed that Germany was winning the war, so they weren't particularly happy with Ebert. But for the moment, the Freikorps were more unhappy with the communists because they saw them as stabbing Germany in the back, effectively telling the workers to go on strike, telling the workers to refuse to make weapons. So the Freikorps are blaming the communists for Germany's defeat. So for the moment, they're prepared to work with Ebert to put down the communist uprising, the Spartacist uprising. So, slide about the Spartacist revolt. The diagram at the bottom there hopefully makes it reasonably clear. You've got in the middle here, you've got Ebert, who is the temporary leader. He is what we call left wing. Anybody in that sort of range here, in the what we call the political spectrum, is a believer that the ordinary people, the poor people, should be given more influence in the running of the country. So he does believe in giving the working classes more influence, but he is a moderate. Okay, in other words, he doesn't want to completely abolish the rich. He just wants a better degree of power sharing between the rich and the poor. Whereas on the extreme left wing, you've got communists. Now, like Ebert, they want to give influence to the workers, but they want to give complete influence to the workers to the extent that the middle classes, the well-off, will be completely abolished. They will lose everything. So Ebert, although he partly agrees with the communists, he doesn't fully agree with the communists. So what Ebert basically does is he turns to the soldiers on the far right who are completely against communism, and he asks them to overthrow the Spartacists. Okay. Now the soldiers on the extreme right are more representative of the rich. That they are what we call nationalistic. They believe that property, if you've worked hard for property, that you should be allowed to keep it. So Ebert is calling on people, the soldiers. He doesn't fully agree with their views either, but he's caught in the middle, and he has to call upon the extreme right to overthrow the extreme left. So what does it demonstrate? It demonstrates that there was significant opposition to the new republic. Okay, just because the republic has been formed, it does not mean it is a popular republic. You have got opposition. You've got the extreme right who dislike the republic. You've got the extreme left who dislike the republic. But the republic is surviving. The leader Ebert has survived, not because he's strong in himself, but because the opponents of the republic are divided. They're not working together, they hate each other, and so Ebert in this occasion is able to play them off against each other. He calls upon the extreme right to crush the extreme left. But that does not mean the republic, the leaders of Germany in the middle, are actually strong. There is a model answer to a question. The question is, choose one of the following. In this case, it's the Spartacist revolt, and explain its importance in challenging the government of the Weimar Republic. Now, there is a separate podcast that walks and talks you through the answer to that question. As you can see, there are 3 levels of answer for you to look at. There's a grade E answer, a grade C answer, and a grade A answer. I'll leave it for the separate podcast, which is myself talking of that one, to walk and talk you through that particular answer, and to talk you through the tips to that particular answer. So that's the end of this podcast on the German Revolution. You now need to move on to the next podcast, which is about the Weimar Constitution. Thank you.